We have participants joining us from different time zones, and we are thrilled to have you all here. We'd love to know who's with us and where you're from in the world, so please feel free to type your name and location in the chat box. Just a few quick housekeeping notes. All participants will be muted during the presentation and during the discussion. This will just help us ensure a smooth flow of information. If you have any questions, please use the chat function. Your questions are very important to us, and we'll address them during the Q&A session. When we reach the Q&A portion, add your questions or comments in the chat and raise your virtual hand or your real hand to ask a question. Feel free to wave if we don't see you, and just remember to mute afterwards to avoid any background noise. We look forward to an engaging discussion, and thank you for being here. So let's get started. As I said, we are thrilled to have you join us for our session called Unlocking the Potential of MPTs, Funding Trends for MPTs, HIV, STIs, and Contraception. First off, let me introduce myself. My name is Claudia van Wyk, and I'm the logistics coordinator today, guiding you through the introductory slides. Following that, we will have presentations from our esteemed discussants, who I will provide more background on in a moment. We will be hearing their insights over the next 25 minutes, and I'm sure they will be invaluable. After the presentations, Audrey Freitas will facilitate a dynamic discussion, and this will be an excellent opportunity for everyone to engage in meaningful dialogue about the future of MPTs. Finally, we'll open the floor for a Q&A session, so please keep your questions ready. We are looking forward to a productive and engaging session with all of you. So the Initiative for MPTs, or IMPT, has been a cornerstone in the global effort to advance multipurpose prevention technologies since its launch in 2009. This unique initiative acts as a neutral platform, bringing together stakeholders from various backgrounds to offer essential technical guidance and strategic direction. Take a moment to think about the significance of this collaboration. By uniting diverse voices, the IMPT works tirelessly to push forward the development of MPTs, which are crucial for HIV prevention and sexual reproductive health. In 2020, recognizing a need for ongoing dialogue, the IMPT introduced the Let's Talk MPTs webinar series. The series has successfully gathered global experts to discuss research and development priorities. It's not only addressed critical issues, but also fostered collaboration and networking among leading figures in the field. As we delve deeper into today's discussion, remember that these efforts are paving the way for innovative solutions in sexual reproductive health and prevention. I'm honored to introduce today's discussants. First off, we have Dr. Bethany Young-Holt. She's the founder and executive director of CAMI Health and co-founder and director of the Initiative for Multipurpose Prevention Technologies. She's also a principal investigator at the Public Health Institute with over 25 years of experience in global health research and programs. She's an epidemiologist by training and has led and contributed to women's health research and programs globally, including Sub-Saharan Africa, the South Pacific, and the US. Bethany has been widely published and has held roles at several institutions. Next, we have Dr. Cecile Ventola from Impact Global Health. Cecile is Impact Global Health's Senior Technical Officer with a focus on sexual, reproductive, and women's health. She has over a decade's worth of experience in sexual and reproductive health, including on male contraceptives, national surveys on sexuality, contraception, abortion and fertility, gender-affirming healthcare, the intersections of gender and health, sexual health, as well as menstrual health. Then we have Audrey Freitas. She's from FHI 360, She's a Senior Technical Officer for Contraceptive Research, Development, and Introduction. She specializes in global contraceptive access, knowledge management, and community development for contraceptive access, for contraceptive research and development, pardon me. Her work includes support as key resources editor of the Contraceptive Technology Innovation Exchange and technical lead for the CTI Tracker, a global resource that monitors and reports on contraceptive technologies in development. Thank you all for being here. Now I'll hand over to Bethany.
Thank you, Claudia. And hello, and thank you to everyone for joining us today. For those of you who may be new to multipurpose prevention technologies, these are products that are designed to combine protection from 2 or more sexual and reproductive health risk into single products, namely unintended pregnancies, HIV, and other STIs or sexually transmitted infections. MPT development is complex, and it involves multiple research disciplines, including the traditionally more siloed areas of HIV, other STIs, and contraception. So the primary focus for MPT development has been to provide women and adolescent girls with more options to address their SRH needs. But more recently, the MPT pipeline has grown to include product candidates that can be used by women and men. So currently, condoms are the only multi-purpose method that's available. And while condoms are effective and good when they're used consistently and correctly, people need more options. An array of new MPTs are in development, representing a diverse array of delivery approaches and targeted indications. And these include intravaginal rings or IVRs, fast-dissolving inserts, vaginal gels, vaginal films. There are implants in development, long-acting injectables, and oral tablets. So since the launching of the initiative for MPTs over 15 years ago, we have been tracking the MPT pipeline in an online database that's aimed to be a resource for MPT stakeholders, including product developers, funders, investors, and advocates. And our updates are annual and comprehensive. We review a variety of sources, including publicly available literature and conference abstracts and funding sources like NIH Reporter. We also reach out directly to all current MPT product developers, and this outreach ensures that we gather the latest development and updates straight from the source, if you will. So for product candidates to be included in the database, they must demonstrate through preclinical or clinical studies positive test results for at least 2 of the following: pregnancy, HIV, and other STIs. And they must also have received funding within the past 3 years, or findings from recently completed studies can be included if they've been published or presented within the past 2 years. And this is really, we have this criteria so that the information presented in the databases is as useful for partners as possible. But I also want to acknowledge the great databases of other groups that we partner with that also monitor MPTs and related areas. And this includes AVAC, the CTI Exchange, and Impact Global Health. So let's take a look at the trends in the MPT pipeline over the past decade. From 2015 to 2025, we've seen some shifts. In 2015, there were 26 MPT product candidates with active funding. But as of 2025, that number decreased to 20. We are still in the process. The IMPT is in our process of our annual MPT update, which will be completed by September, so this number may change. But these figures do reflect the dynamic nature of this field, and Cecile will be discussing this in more detail in her talk. But for more information, you can visit the mpt.org database. So if we zoom in and look at what is in the MPT pipeline as of right now, as of May 2025, there are 20 actively funded product candidates. The majority of these candidates are in preclinical development and are primarily focused on combining anti-HIV drugs with hormonal or non-hormonal contraceptives into single products. A variety of MPT delivery types are in the pipeline, with intravaginal rings being the most prevalent of these. You'll see that there are 7 MPT candidates that are IVRs right now. The MPT that has advanced the furthest in the pipeline is the dual prevention pill, or the DPP, which combines oral contraception with PrEP. And we're really excited that we will be sharing more information about the TPP status in an upcoming webinar featuring colleagues from AVAC and the Population Council, so you can stay tuned for that. If you're interested in learning more, you can check out the MPT product database, mpts101.org. As I mentioned, we are in the process of our annual update. So if you're aware of other MPTs that are not reflected in this database, please reach out to us and let us know. So the majority of MPTs in the pipeline right now are being developed by academic institutions, small biotech companies, and nonprofit laboratories. Recently, a pharmaceutical company has joined the MPT development effort, contributing their resources to advancing the DPP, or dual prevention pill. And this really marks a positive collaborative partnership for the field. Current MPT supporting agencies are primarily government funders, and notably the National Institutes of Health, which plays a pivotal role in backing early stage product development. But there has been some other moderate backing from philanthropic organizations and foundations, so non-US government funders and the private sector. So finally, before handing this over to Cecile, I want to give an overview of the product development pathway and briefly note the stages and challenges ahead for MPT R&D. Most MPTs currently in development are in early stages of product development, during which time product development can encounter the proverbial valley of death. Due to challenges that include regulatory failures, manufacturing challenges, and de-risking products for potential investors, such as demonstrating the potential return on investment, or the ROI and market potential of MPT products candidates. And addressing these challenges, needless to say, requires funding. Moreover, product candidates may confront obstacles after clinical trials and licensures, but these challenges are still a ways down the road for product development. So in closing, while drug development is a time-consuming and difficult and expensive process, MPTs are potential game changers for women's health, both in low and middle income countries and upper and higher income countries. Reflecting on the opportunities and challenges facing the field, the MPT field is complex, and financial backing is needed to support the most promising product candidates to advance through the pipeline. An innovative product candidate that doesn't get into the hands of the users could just be a great chemical entity and not an actual product. So at the same time, the MPT is relatively new and dynamic, with some innovative work being done in this field. There is growing multidisciplinary and stakeholder engagement in the field. In fact, the initiative for MPTs includes over 2,000 stakeholders representing nearly 24 countries. And this includes stakeholders from the public and private sectors. So with the changing funding landscape that we're all experiencing, this is an opportunity to explore innovative funding and investment partnerships. So with that, I am delighted to hand it over to Cecile. Thank you.
Thank you, Bethany. Going to share my screen. And please let me know if there's any problem. So hi everyone. So I'm from Impact Global Health, and I'm going to be complementing the overview that Bethany just gave us with some data on the global R&D landscape for MPTs. And for this, I am going to use the G-Finder survey that is being conducted since 2007 by Impact Global Health. So it's an annual tracker of R&D investment for global health. We are using publicly available data from certain funders like the US NIH or the EU, but we also have a survey among over 300 participants from industry, philanthropy, other public funders to give us an overview of what's being spent every year for global health R&D. We've been collecting data on sexual and reproductive health R&D since 2018. That includes contraception, STIs, multipurpose prevention technologies, HPV, preeclampsia, and postpartum hemorrhage. And last year, we expanded our scope to include additional gynecological and maternal health conditions and abortion. In general, our scope is LMIC focused, so mostly products that could benefit populations living in LMICs. For SRH, we have a bit of a different approach, which is LMIC applicable to reflect the fact that there is a dual market there. Unlike, for example, neglected diseases, for SRH, there might be products that are not developed with LMIC markets in mind, but that might be applicable and benefit also these populations. So before I dive in, all of our data is available online. We have our portal with everything. So if you want to go and have a play around with it, you can. And we just recently published our latest SRH report. Is this the new era? That is also going over 6 years of funding for global R&D in this field. So let's take a look at what it looks like for MPTs in this time period. So the first observation that we can make is that funding has been decreasing in the past 6 years for MPTs, with 35 million less than in 2018 in 2023, which is a 55% decrease. And it's actually a record low since we started tracking data for MPTs. On the graph here, you have the different types of funders involved in this field. In yellow, you have industry, in blue, public funding, and in orange, philanthropy. And maybe you can see it from the graph, but basically the peaks and decreases that we've seen over the years are mostly driven by fluctuations in industry investment. So with a decrease of 99% since 2018, because it has virtually disappeared from being as high as 46 million in 2018 and being actually the majority of funding back then. These fluctuations are mostly due to changes in microbicyc funding. So there were some microbicyc-based MPTs that were being developed and in clinical trials, but the trial failed, and that's also why most of this funding has disappeared now. So the first massive trend is this sharp decrease in industry investment. You can also see that public funding has been evolving, mostly growing, with doubling between 2018 and 2022, but is decreasing again in the past year. So this is the main change. What this change also means in terms of funders is that the dependency on US government funding has been increasing. So here you have the same graph, but we have split public funding between US government funding and other public funding. And by US government funding, we mean mostly US NIH and USAID. And the orange line that you see across the graph is showing the percentage, the proportion of funding that is being dispersed by US government agencies. And as you can see, the dependency or the proportion of that funding has been growing from about a quarter in 2018 to 75% in 2023. As we know, that means that the ecosystem is particularly fragile because USAID funding is not going to be continuing, and that we can expect some cuts from US NIH in the coming years. So this dependency is actually really jeopardizing the future of the field. Across the 6 years of data, US government funding represented over 80% of all public funding overall. And there is actually a lack of alternative major stakeholders. So for example, for 2023, there were only 2 other major public funders that contributed over $1 million, and actually just one other philanthropic one, the Gates Foundation, but otherwise no one else. So taken together, US government funding and industry contributed 86% of all MPT funding across the time period. And with what we know now about the current industry investment and the future of US investment, that means the ecosystem is pretty fragile with potential dire consequences in the years to come. So that's not a very encouraging picture I'm painting, I'm very aware. What can be interesting to also consider is how these different changes contribute to what kind of R&D is being financed. So here we took a look at the different clinical stages of what was being funded every year, the proportion of it. So you have basic and early stage research, clinical development, and specified. So one of the major change is the decrease in clinical development from 75% to 12% in 2023. This is mostly due to a decreased industry involvement because most of the clinical development was actually funded by industry. And as a consequence, the proportion of basic and early stage research has risen from 20% to 57%. This is also because now most of the funding, majority of the funding comes from the US NIH, which tends to focus on basic and early stage research. What we mean with unspecified here is core funding for multi-product and multi-sites research that includes potentially several products, so also preclinical research as well as clinical development potentially. This is a category that is mostly publicly funded and with, again, an important role of US funding, which potential changes in the years to come. So these changes, they reflect basically the changes in funders and levels of investment, but they also mean that in 2023, the majority of R&D funding for MPTs went to basic and early stage research, which means that the path to market is longer and certain for these products, maybe more so than before. So all this information that I've just given to you, it is kind of unlikely that MPTs are going to make it to the market in the next years. And these funding trends are particularly negative. So when trying to maybe contextualize them and also find potential solutions, we also wanted to compare what's happening in the MPT fields to what is happening with sort of adjacent products, such as contraceptives and STIs products, to sort of understand whether that is linked or not. So on this graph, you can compare the trends for these different product categories. And as you can see, it's looking quite differently for R&D for STIs, which has been going up and actually reaching a record high in 2023, with over 122 million more spent in 2023 than 2018, which is overall 127% growth. For contraception R&D, things have not been going in the same direction as STIs. It's rather comparable to MPTs with a loss of 18 million and 15% in the 6 years. The decline is to be seen in both private and public funding. In general, industry hasn't been very at the forefront of contraceptive research. That is connected to history with a perception of liability for this research that has to do with certain scandals in the past with the Dalkin Shield IUD, for example, and with the fact that these products are being trialed and then marketed for healthy people so that insurance prices for this research is higher than for the products. There's also a perceived low return on investment that has to do with the fact that there's a perception that the contraceptive market might be saturated with a lot of options that are available. But the contraceptive field is a bit different than, let's say, a treatment for a certain pathology. Actually, diversification is what is needed there for efficacy and uptake and observance. And there are actually a range of demands from contraceptive users, of need from contraceptive users that are unmet. such as non-hormonal products or male contraceptives or user-controlled products, so that there is actually a market there, but is not perceived as such, often by industry. So that's been traditionally compensated by public investment to de-risk the research. So often public funding for early stage research, and then partnerships with private stakeholders for the later stages and bringing the products to market. So this has been happening, for example, with Conrad or PATH or the Population Council. But as we see here with public investment going down, that might be also jeopardized, that kind of partnerships. The only good news for contraceptive R&D is that philanthropic investment has been going up a bit in the 6 years, but probably not enough to compensate the overall decrease. What we see here is that these trends are mostly influenced by industry investment. So when we take a closer look at it, actually the differences are even sharper. So this is only industry investment in R&D. So for STIs, as you can see, it's been going up a lot, 100 millions. That is a growth of 790% over the past 6 years. And actually, industry investment is responsible for 82% of the overall growth of STI R&D funding. This is mostly going to STIs with a dual market, so namely herpes and gonorrhea. That is because gonorrhea doesn't have a cure, and gonorrhea has some treatments available, but with the AMR risk, they might not be available in the future. And so it is perceived that there is a market also in HICs for this, so much so that these two STIs represent 65% and 17% of the overall growth, respectively. This is mostly going to vaccines and biologics. So there is really this perception of potentially high return on investment for STIs, which is not the case, as you can see here, for contraception that has been going down, and MPTs where industry investments has almost vanished. So it looks like MPTs are not being perceived as part of the STI products arsenal, or with this potential high return on investment that STIs benefit from, and rather that they are being considered just like contraceptives as having a potentially limited market and an expensive and high-risk clinical development. Another data point that is interesting here is that the majority of the funding from industry for STIs comes from multinationals, 87%, while when there was industry funding for MPTs, it all came from small and middle-sized enterprises. So what comes out of this comparison is that maybe there is a case to be made for larger industry involvement in MPTs, so that also bigger companies can be interested and take over the phases of development that cost the most money. This can be particularly interesting to make the case for bigger industry, is to highlight the fact that MPTs have a tradition of being more user-centric in their design, and that we might actually be able to demonstrate that there is a potential markets for them, not just for the STI risk, but also for the contraceptive element. So when we compare, for example, characteristic of contraceptive MPTs to normal contraceptive development, we can see that MPTs have been sort of paving the way for important characteristics that are actually in demand with users. So looking specifically at hormonal versus non-hormonal, you can see that traditionally you have non-hormonal products here in bright orange, that the funding for R&D for MPTs has been focusing on non-hormonal products. It has been declining in the last years due to the decline in microbicid research, because microbicid were non-hormonal products. And actually, it's the first time in 2023 that the proportion of MPTs funded non-hormonal is lower than for contraceptive R&D. But there is this tradition of offering an alternative to hormonal contraception that is very much highly thought after for contraceptive users. And for user control, you can also see here that there has been a focus in the past years in user-controlled technologies. This is also going down for the same reasons as for the non-hormonal, but it remains the majority in a higher proportion than for contraceptive R&D. So there is just one exception to that. User-centric design and the possibility of meeting unmet needs in contraception is the fact that none of the funding that we captured is for MPTs targeting male users, while contraceptive research has been slowly making more space for that. But there is still like this tradition of highly user-centric design that can also help making the case for the potential for MPTs and the potential market for them. So as a conclusion, when looking at the general landscape, the main message is that funding for MPTs has been decreasing, with a record low level registered in 2023 in our survey, and a sharp decrease in industry investment. The ecosystem in general is pretty fragile because it's highly dependent on US funding that is unlikely to be sustained in the coming years. And if you add that to the fact that most research is in its early stages, it's unlikely that MPTs could make it to the market in coming years if no alternatives are found. But this all points towards the necessity to make the case for maybe more industry investment in MPTs. As I showed you, there is strong industry involvement in STIs because there's a perception of a potentially high return on investment. And so maybe there's a need to change the perception of a limited market or limited return on investment for MPTs by highlighting the fact that they have this STI component as well, and also by showing that they can meet specific user demands in terms of contraceptive design. There is a traditional mechanism of de-risking clinical development with public-private partnerships, but it's also maybe about showing that there is this potential market, showing that to industry partners, but also showing it to potential buyers and potential insurance national schemes, because of course there's an economical and societal impact of these products potentially, and that would also help making the case for them. That was all on my side, and everything can be found on our website, of course.
Cecile, thank you for such a thoughtful and excellent presentation. I have so many thoughts that came out of that. But just it's really interesting, as you point out, that as the funding for MPTs has gone down, STIs investments have gone up. And just thinking about sort of opportunities, maybe it's because I'm making lemonade out of lemons kind of. I like to have that attitude, but that's really interesting. I also wanted to it made me want to just note for everyone that there is going to be an MPT symposium at the STI HIV World Congress that's focused on STIs in 2 weeks and in 3 weeks in Montreal. So anyway, thank you again. But before we open this up for our interactive discussion portion of the webinar, I'd love to again welcome Audrey Freitas from FHI 360 for joining us today. And Audrey, we would love to hear your insights on the presentation. You've just heard the presentations and reflections on how how this all relates to what you're seeing and working on regarding contraceptive trends.
Absolutely. I think just as a little bit of starter context, FHI 360 maintains a resource called the Contraceptive Technology Innovation Exchange. And through that platform, we have a free publicly accessible database called the CTI Tracker that monitors progress on contraceptive development from early development all the way through to single country regulatory approval. And so it's with that hat that I'm thinking about some of the things that you, Bethany, and Cecile talked about. And I think it's interesting to start with noting where MPTs align with broader trends in contraceptive development, but also where they diverge. MPTs are a unique product category, but for the sake of knowledge exchange and learning from one another, I think it's also a good idea to link it into a bigger field. So thinking about what we see in the CTI tracker, from a product profile standpoint, the heavy focus on vaginally administered products definitely reflects our bigger industry. 1 in 4 of the concepts in the tracker are intended to be used vaginally. And I think that's likely to be associated with a couple things. The first is that there is a moderately more straightforward development pathway for topical products as opposed to systemic products. Certainly not an easy development pathway, but it is a little bit more straightforward. There's also the trends that Impact Global Health has noted in funder interest in user-controlled methods and an attempt to capture a part of this market that may not be currently interested in the products available. And so we're definitely aligned there. We also see very similar patterns in development stage. There are more contraceptive-only products moving into the clinic, possibly just because the single indication R&D space is a little bit more established, but more than 2/3 of the records in the CTI tracker are in early development or preclinical evaluation. And that's a number that's going to be like kind of a no-brainer, like a duh number for people who work in this space. It's definitely not a surprise. But I think the public may not always have a clear window into just how significant of a leap it is scientifically, from a regulatory perspective, from a financial perspective, from preclinical evaluation to human evaluation. That, as you really aptly called it, Bethany, it is a valley of death for products, and that we see them kind of failing to take that leap. But there are a couple points of divergence that I noted as I was listening to both of you. For example, Cecile shared that the proportion of funding for non-hormonal MPTs is slightly down, that hormonal and non-hormonal now have about equal funding, and then a significant portion is kind of non-specific. We do not track the amount of funding going to every product in our database, but I can tell you that just on quantity, non-hormonal contraceptives for kind of single-use products are edging out hormonal by what we think is probably a growing margin. And I'd say that that's being driven by non-hormonal male methods. As both of you noted, there's not currently a contraceptive MPT being developed specifically for male users, but we do see a fair number of non-hormonal male contraceptives under development. Finally, as a last point, I'd quickly note that everybody will have seen that really dramatic decline in industry funding for MPTs between 2018 and 2023. Seeing it drop to 0, I think, is kind of shocking, even for those of us who are keyed into that. That shift, of course, has also happened in contraceptive-only research, but we started to see the downslide a lot earlier as major industry players moved to a lower risk strategy when it came to product development. And so we see a slightly different timeline for that. And we also now have the benefit of many years of watching that decline and not seeing a rebound. So I think it is really worth, not to be a downer at the end of this, but it is really worth thinking about the possibility that industry may not come back. And what do you do in a space where industry is not returning? So that's a couple initial thoughts. I thought both presentations were really thought-provoking.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Audrey. That was, yeah, great to get your reflections and sort of launch us now into our discussion portion of the webinar. So I'd like to just remind everyone that if you do have questions, just enter them into the chat. If there are some already, both Cheryl and Claudia are going to be monitoring that on our end too. And if you have questions, you can enter it in the chat or just raise your hand and you can ask it. If we really aim, one of the goals for these webinars too, we actually started this during COVID where nobody was going and seeing anyone. So this was really launched as a way to sort of form a community and network. So feel free to take yourself off of, you know, put your face on Zoom if you want to connect with people. So yeah, we have a couple questions that we wanted to maybe as we're getting started, just to sort of, as people are compiling their thoughts, to a couple questions that have been submitted ahead of time. So one question, and maybe Cecile, you can take this if you feel like it. So the presenters, I can add to it too. This is a question. The presenters have spoken to some of the challenges facing the field of MPT development, including persistent limitations in funding and the high-risk nature of clinical development. What are some of the potential solutions to managing what may be a very constrained environment for MPT development in the coming years? And punting it over to you, Cecile, because you started to talk about opportunities to look at ROI for the dual market potential for, STIs. That there are STI MPTs in the pipeline. So love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I guess I can answer also with some of the things that you have presented, like the challenges are the complex development in general, like having to test for several indications. And so that requires actually more funding than when there's only one indication to test and all of that. And I think there's also the fact that contraceptive research has not been really a focus for industry for decades now, and that we can potentially like adapt this what has been created as a to compensate for that was like this partnership was early stages being funded by public investments, but as we can see, the public investment are going down, and that might not be a solution that is sustainable in the long run. So I think that might be a lot of wishful thinking on my part, but I can't help but wonder when I look at the STI R&D trends to like there is a perception of high return for STIs, and I think this is really correlated to also like perceived demand from potential payers, because like the AMR risk is not always public knowledge for gonorrhea, for example, and so it's because payers and insurance schemes are ready to talking about these things that it also looks like a viable avenue for research for the industry. And so I find it really interesting to see that there is no perception of this STI potential for high income markets, because that is what is needed for industry to get into things. And I think it's maybe also just like there's the complexity of the research, but it might be a visibility issue. And correct me if I'm wrong, Bethany, but I feel like often also this type of research, MPT research, has come from an advocacy perspective, with often like women-led enterprises that are looking to cater to the needs of women and girls in LMICs, which is a very, very like noble cause and a very noble motivation, but that might also be a part of why it's not perceived as more than that. And of course, it would be wonderful to help this population, but I think industry needs different arguments. And this idea of products that would be user-controlled, that would offer multiple indications to users, I think has a potential market in HICs as well. It's just a matter of making this visible to potential users, to industry stakeholders, and to potential payers as well.
Excellent. I'm going to just add on to that a bit, just sort of thinking more along like what you were just saying is like if we look at antimicrobial resistant STIs and other STIs, they're really increasing globally, including in the United States where I'm based, and I think in parts of Europe and other parts of the world. And then also, we're seeing even here in the United States that there are people who are coming in and using emergency rooms and using other facilities for sort of the downs, like the emergency impacts of these, getting an STI, an unintended pregnancy, a botched abortion. So there might be an untapped opportunity to really make the case for these more preventative approaches before a disaster happens or a big problem happens. So I think those are other things I think we can start thinking about as a field collectively to meet if we're really about addressing people's unmet needs and prevention. And Cynthia, I hate to put you on the spot, but I see you off the screen, and Cynthia is my colleague from the Public Health Institute, and she directs a really cool program called Bridge that is focused on emergency room treatment. Would you mind? I know we've talked about it a bit, but commenting on that.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thanks, Stephanie, and I really appreciate this discussion. And yes, Bridge is part of the Public Health Institute as well, and we address public health crises from the emergency department. Here in the United States, the emergency department is really the only 24-hour safety net, and increasingly so, it is where many people receive the only point of care to the healthcare system. And so my program really focuses on identifying and treating people for syphilis, HIV, and hepatitis C virus. And I think there's a huge opportunity for not just the emergency department to be this low barrier connection of care for prevention, but Bethany, as you refer to, other areas too. And I'm really interested in this connection between doxypep. So, as you mentioned, the strategy to prevent bacterial, sexually transmitted infections, chlamydia, gonorrhea, and syphilis, and the MPT world, and sort of how that public health really emerging best practice of doxypep that is really well talked about, well regarded, really being implemented here in California and across the US for the crisis that we're having, particularly in syphilis and other STIs, and how that can connect to other MPTs. I'm curious y'all's thoughts about that, any partnerships there.
Yeah, thank you. Any other thoughts on that and, perspectives?
I'd say it's a little bit of a tangential perspective, but I think it is connected to this question of how do we build relationships with other public health goals and other public health initiatives. I think failure is very poorly documented in our field. And as everybody has described, we're facing some really significant challenges. And as we head into coming years, I think one of the things that will help us build relationships with new programs, that will help us break into connections with new industries, is candor and transparency about what's working and what isn't, and why. I think that kind of transparency is one of the things that helps keep some of these really essential technology platforms afloat. We have a mission at CTI Exchange to promote collaboration, and in what can often be a very competitive space. It's not like any of these programs, including at the broader field of STIs, are awash with funding and resources. And I think a willingness to be honest with one another is definitely the rising tide that lifts all boats. And so one of the things I think I would say in attempting to build stronger relationships with the STI space is a willingness and an ability to come kind of with arms open and to say, this is what we're working with and this is what we can do. And to not see it as a competitive opportunity necessarily.
Super, thank you. I'm excited to see that we have a couple people who have added comments in the chat. Since in the spirit of having interaction with this group and community, I wanted to see if Laura, if you would like to unmute yourself and ask the question, and then we can move over to Tapaya.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Unfortunately, I don't have a camera on this computer, but at least I can speak. So I am the founder of a tiny, whiny startup that's making contraceptives for men. So I'm facing this dilemma about funding firsthand, and I'm talking to investors, especially VC, and I'm getting mixed responses out of that. But my question was mostly if you have any, you can, offer any projections about the impact that the Big Beautiful Bill will have on the private sectors. I've heard mixed responses. Many think that actually it will boost and it will help startups. And I'm wondering whether that is true, or I know we can't predict the future, but do you have any, foresight about what this might mean in terms of, company funding in your, MPT and contraceptives?
Well, all I know is that we're all watching, and I really don't know. So I think we are so we're waiting and seeing. So anyone else have perspectives on that?
So maybe I can ask a related question. I was typing it in, but since it's related to this, does anyone have any direct or first-hand information about what is perceived, what are the sticky points, and what is perceived as particularly spooky by investors, aside from what you have already mentioned, which is the path to commercialization may be a bit more difficult, long, unclear, fuzzy, and that may spook some VC. But anything else that when talking to them may change the narrative and actually trigger their interest. Do you have any firsthand, any one of you has talked with VCs directly and can speak as to what is it that scares them so much when you talk to them and you pitch to them?
Well, in some of the work that we were doing for other projects, I've talked to VCs and they're interested. I'm sure you're aware of the risk, the ROI, de-risking the products. That's sort of aligns with what we were talking about in the valley of death stage, like some of the risks that product developers have. I don't know if anyone else has more details, but those are things that we've seen throughout, and I don't think it'll really change with this build necessarily. I think those are things that are just sort of standard that VCs are concerned about. I don't know if that answers your question. Is probably a very detailed question, but yeah.
Yeah, this is Cheryl. I'll jump in with just my initial thoughts on that is, yeah, risk is always something that is very difficult to deal with. And of course, the more you can de-risk it, the better that it looks. And, venture capitalists, from my very limited view, they want in and out. So they really want you to present that exit plan before you're even getting them into the door. So you want that exit plan in place, how they're going to be able to turn that around, how they're going to make that ROI. Typically, it's usually as quick as possible, is what they're looking for. I think what will also be interesting, so we did a lot of interviews with another project that we're working on, and they weren't necessarily with venture capitalists, but they were with industry partners. And it was really about risk and ROI, as we can all predict. And they prefer to jump in, of course, once it's been de-risked in that late phase 3, phase 4 position on in that area. And so what we're hoping, no promises quite yet, but we're hoping to host part 2 of this webinar, which will really look at a potential of that intermediate risk that we were talking about, is that private-public partnership, and sort of digging in and in this new space of getting to move forward in a different direction, of what that might look like to really carry this field forward. So we definitely invite you to stay tuned. We have an expert in mind. I won't mention any names now, but yeah, please stay tuned for part 2, where we're sort of going to dig in and look on the optimistic view of how can we change how we've done things up until now, and look for future investments. So Laura, I hope we see you back for that next presentation webinar.
I have a quick final addition before we wrap up. First of all, Laura, great to see you. Laura has participated in the development of our CTI tracker. But also 2 years ago, we hosted an event about innovative strategies for contraceptive R&D funding. And as part of that event, which was hosted in collaboration with Impact Global Health, actually, we had a really thoughtful presentation from RH Capital, which is a venture capitalist team focused on reproductive health products. And they were able to be extremely candid about what causes them to bulk on a potential investment, and why they make the decisions that they make. And so I'll pop a link in the chat. It was a really thought-provoking event, and I think opened kind of a door into how these venture capitalist teams make their decisions about these products.
Great, thank you. And we have just one more question from Tapewa. I don't know. do you want to ask that question really quick and then we'll just have to wrap up?
Yeah,
Yes,
good to see you too. Oh, sorry, good to see you, Tapiwa.
yes, good to see you too. So I was just trying to find out why the industry, so much investment or private funding is going into STIs. Is it specifically for treatment, for diagnostics, for prevention? And if their activities that they are doing has any intersection with what has been established for MPTs already?
I guess I could give a brief response for that. So what we see with the GFinder data is that STI R&D investment go towards mostly herpes and gonorrhea. And as I was briefly mentioning in my presentation, that is because there is a perceived market in high-income countries as well for both treatment and preventative and therapeutic vaccines. So most of the funding and the growth that we've witnessed in the past years is going towards these product categories of biologics and vaccines, and for these two specific STIs. If we look at diagnostics, for example, this has been actually going down in the past 6 years, the level of funding for diagnostics, and because the needs there are often like point of care diagnostics are mostly needed in low resource settings. And the perception of like there's no high market for this in HICs because lab facilities are available most of the time. So there's really this difference between what is being perceived as potentially very profitable investment or not. And I hope that answers your question, but there is more details on Impact Global Health website for each condition. You can go through the data and it will be there's a bit more explanations as to what are the trends and what are the changes product by product or type of funder by type of funder on the website. And I can put it in the chat as well.
Well, thank you, everyone. I think we could keep going, but all great things must come to an end. So I want to thank everyone again for your talk, Cecile, contributions, Audrey. As with all past webinars, today's webinar recording will be available on the MPT Learning Event website at theimpt.org. And you can also visit our past webinars and other resources. Also invite you to sign up for the IMPT newsletter if you haven't done so already. As we've talked about, we are planning several more webinars in our series over the next coming months, so stay tuned for that. So just want to also express my gratitude for the support for this work. Grateful to be housed at the Public Health Institute. And also like to extend our thanks to NIH for supporting this work and the webinar and our other supporters. So for more information and to get in touch, please visit our website. You can also reach out to us directly. Okay, thank you. And I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your days. Bye-bye.